48 hours ago, the most powerful office on Earth walked into a room filled with the people who actually run the world. And in less than 3 hours, everything fell apart. Not gradually, not behind closed doors, but live, in front of cameras, in front of 2,700 billionaires, 60 heads of state, and every major financial institution on the planet. What you are about to hear is not another political scandal that will disappear by the weekend. This is the moment when reality itself fought back against 5 years of manufactured narratives. And it did not just push back. It delivered a knockout blow that was transmitted simultaneously to every trading floor, every intelligence agency, and every capital city from Tokyo to London to Washington. If you are watching this right now, you need to subscribe immediately and turn on all notifications, because what unfolds in the next 48 hours will determine whether the American presidency can survive the most devastating collapse of credibility in modern history. We have sources inside the Davos conference halls. We have leaked documents that major news networks have not reported yet. We have real-time market data that tells a story nobody else is connecting. This is breaking faster than any newsroom can track, and you do not want to miss a single development. Let me be absolutely clear about what was at stake in that room. The World Economic Forum in Davos is not just another international conference. This is where $40 trillion in managed assets come together. This is where the future of NATO gets quietly negotiated over private dinners. This is where the credibility of the global reserve currency either gets reinforced or begins to crumble. And on January 23rd, 2025, all of that came crashing down in the span of one speech. Here is what you need to understand about Davos before we go any further. This is not a campaign rally in Pennsylvania where the crowd cheers because you promised to make America great again. This is not a friendly interview on a sympathetic cable news network where the host nods along with your talking points. Davos is fundamentally different, and that difference is what destroyed Trump in real time. At a political rally, you are speaking to believers, people who already trust you, people who want to believe your version of reality, people who will accept your framing of events even when the facts are questionable. You can say the economy is booming, and if your supporters feel good about their own lives, they will believe you. You can say the election was rigged, and if they distrust institutions, they will accept that narrative. For 5 years, Donald Trump operated inside a reality distortion field where his personality, combined with a media ecosystem built to amplify his message, allowed him to bend facts, twist narratives, and reshape public perception to match whatever story he wanted to tell that day. But Davos operates on an entirely different system. The people in that room do not care about your poll numbers. They do not care about your Twitter followers or your cable news ratings. They care about one thing and one thing only: money. And money does not negotiate with reality. Money does not respond to charisma or personality or branding. Money responds to fundamentals, balance sheets, liquidity, risk assessment, verifiable data. You cannot tweet your way out of a margin call. You cannot hold a rally to change the laws of supply and demand. You cannot gaslight a bond market. This is why what happened on Thursday afternoon, January 23rd, 2025, was so catastrophic. Trump walked into that room with 3 narratives he thought were bulletproof. First, the Greenland deal. He believed he could announce a completed territorial acquisition and the world would simply accept it because he said so. Second, economic supremacy. He planned to point at stock market numbers and claim American financial dominance was unshakable. Third, strongman diplomacy. He intended to threaten Canada, demand European compliance, and demonstrate that American power could bend weaker nations to its will. All 3 of those narratives were built on the same foundation: the belief that reality is negotiable, that if you say something confidently enough, loudly enough, repeatedly enough, it becomes true simply because you willed it into existence. But while Trump was flying across the Atlantic, while his team was preparing his speech, while he was rehearsing his talking points, 3 traps were being set. And what Trump did not know, what his advisors apparently did not anticipate, was that by the time his plane touched down in Switzerland, it was already too late. The collapse was already in motion. The speech began exactly as planned. President Trump walked to the podium with that signature confidence, the red tie perfectly knotted, the slow, deliberate stride, the thumbs up to the audience. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the sea of faces, the most powerful people in global finance and politics sitting in rows before him, and he began to speak. Within 90 seconds, he made a claim so audacious, so demonstrably false, that it would trigger the first coordinated diplomatic walkout in the 55-year history of the World Economic Forum. He said, and I am reading directly from the official transcript that was circulated to every delegation in that hall, "My friends, we have secured the Arctic. The deal with Denmark is done. This is the greatest real estate transaction since the Louisiana Purchase. We now have total control. The American flag will effectively fly over the strategic resources of the North. This is American sovereignty expanding in a way that has not happened in over a century." Let me break down what just happened in that moment. Trump took a preliminary framework discussion, a conversation about potential mining lease agreements that had not even been presented to the Danish parliament for committee review, and he rebranded it as a completed sovereign territorial acquisition. He tried to sell a rental negotiation as a conquest. He stood in front of the global financial elite and claimed he had purchased Greenland. Now, here is what Trump and his team apparently did not anticipate. Normally, when a world leader stretches the truth at Davos, there is an unspoken protocol. Diplomats sit politely. They take notes. They make uncomfortable eye contact with each other, and then later, through quiet back channels, they issue a carefully worded correction that allows everyone to save face. But the geopolitical environment right now is not normal. The tension in Europe is not theoretical anymore. It is existential. NATO is fracturing over burden-sharing disputes. American tariff threats are real and hitting European industries hard. The security guarantees that held for 80 years are disintegrating in real time. European leaders are not in the mood for diplomatic courtesy anymore. They are in survival mode. Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, was sitting in the front row in the section exclusively reserved for heads of state. And she did something that has never happened before in the history of this forum. She stood up. She did not shout. She did not interrupt. She did not cause a scene. She simply gathered her briefing papers, rose from her seat, turned her back to the podium, and walked directly toward the exit. And it was choreographed. This was not a spontaneous emotional reaction. Within seconds, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, stood up. Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, stood up. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, stood up. In a silent, devastating wave, the entire European Union delegation, representing the largest single economic bloc on Earth, walked out of the main hall while the President of the United States was still speaking. The cameras caught everything. Trump saw it happening in real time. His eyes darted from the teleprompter to the emptying front row. You could see the calculation happening behind his expression. His rhythm broke. He stammered for just a fraction of a second, then improvised a line that will be studied in political communication courses for decades. He said, "I see some very busy people have to catch their planes. Very important people. Very busy schedules." It was a desperate attempt to reframe a public humiliation as a scheduling conflict. But everyone in that room, everyone watching the live stream, everyone monitoring the event from trading desks and government offices around the world knew exactly what was happening. Those leaders were not catching planes. They were sending a message. And the message came through with absolute clarity within 2 minutes. While Trump was still at the podium, still trying to recover his composure, still attempting to pivot to his economic talking points, a joint press release hit every Bloomberg terminal in that room simultaneously. The phones of every chief executive officer, every central banker, every hedge fund manager started lighting up at exactly the same moment. The screens glowed blue. People stopped watching the stage and started reading their devices. And what they read was devastating. The statement was issued jointly by the governments of Denmark, Germany, France, and the European Commission. It read, "The sovereignty of Greenland is not negotiable and is not for sale under any circumstances. There is no transfer of territorial control. There exists only a preliminary framework for discussion regarding commercial access to certain natural resources. The characterization presented by the American president is factually incorrect, legally void, and diplomatically unacceptable." Think about the precision of that language. Factually incorrect, legally void, diplomatically unacceptable. That is not diplomatic spin. That is not careful wording designed to preserve the relationship. That is a coordinated demolition of credibility executed in real time. The European Union just told the world in the clearest possible terms that the President of the United States was lying. Not mistaken, not confused, lying. Trump had completely lost the room. The audience was no longer listening to him. They were reading the rebuttal on their phones. He was standing at the podium bragging about a deal that the other party had just publicly, officially, and immediately rejected. He looked isolated. He looked delusional. He looked like a man trying to sell a property he does not own to buyers who already know the title is fake. But here is where the disaster accelerated into something far worse. Sensing that he was losing control of the geopolitical narrative, Trump made a critical tactical error. He wiped his forehead. You could see the perspiration on the close-up camera feed, and he pivoted to what he thought was safe ground, the economy. He said, "Forget the politics for a moment. Let us talk about what really matters. Money. The numbers do not lie. The American dollar is the king of currencies. Our stock market has never been stronger. We are the envy of the entire world. If you want to win, if you want to make real returns, you put your money in America." At that exact moment, and I mean the literal second those words left his mouth, the Bank of Japan lost control of the yield curve. The timing was almost supernatural. It was as if the financial markets themselves were watching this speech and decided to deliver their own verdict. The 10-year Japanese government bond yield spiked 40 basis points in under 3 minutes. For those of you who are not financial professionals, let me translate that. That is a catastrophic move. That is the kind of volatility that happens maybe once or twice in a decade. And it happened while Trump was claiming markets had never been stronger. Here is why this matters. The global financial system runs on something called the carry trade. Investors borrow money in Japanese yen at near zero interest rates, then invest that borrowed money in higher yielding assets around the world, particularly in American stocks and bonds. This system has been fueling market rallies for years. It works beautifully as long as Japanese interest rates stay low and stable. But when those rates spike suddenly, when the cost of borrowing yen jumps by 40 basis points in 3 minutes, the algorithms that manage trillions of dollars in these trades detect the instability and start unwinding positions at machine speed. And that is exactly what happened. Within minutes, the Nikkei stock index in Tokyo went into freefall, down 3%, then 6%, then 9%. By the time trading was halted for the day, the Nikkei had collapsed 12.4%. $400 billion in market value evaporated while Trump was still on stage claiming the economy had never been stronger. The split screen was absolutely brutal. On one side, Trump at the podium saying markets have never been stronger. On the other side, Japanese stock tickers showing blood red numbers, pension funds hemorrhaging value, global investors watching their portfolios collapse in real time. But the carnage was not contained to Tokyo. The contagion spread across every major market simultaneously. South Korean pension funds, which hold massive positions in Japanese equities, triggered automatic stop-loss orders. European insurance companies, whose portfolios are heavily weighted toward Asian bonds, saw their risk models flash red warnings. American hedge funds that had leveraged positions in the carry trade faced margin calls they could not meet. Within 30 minutes, S&P 500 futures dropped 3.2%. The VIX, the so-called fear index that measures market volatility, spiked to levels not seen since the pandemic crash of 2020. And all of this was happening while Trump was still speaking. The people in that audience were not listening to his words anymore. They were watching their portfolios disintegrate on their phones. They were receiving urgent calls from their trading desks. They were calculating how much money they had just lost in the last 20 minutes. Trump kept talking about American economic strength while the evidence of economic chaos was literally unfolding in the pockets of everyone in front of him. Then came the third simultaneous disaster. Back in Manhattan at exactly 3:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which was 9:47 p.m. in Davos, the sheriff of New York County served formal seizure notices at Trump Tower. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was not a legal filing that would take months to process. This was an actual enforcement action. Officers of the court, accompanied by building security and Secret Service agents who had to coordinate the logistics, delivered official documents stating that the property known as Trump Tower was now subject to asset seizure under a $454 million civil fraud judgment. The timing was not coincidental. The New York Attorney General's office had been preparing this move for weeks, waiting for the optimal moment to execute. And they chose the exact moment when Trump would be on the world stage, unable to respond, unable to hold an emergency press conference, unable to control the narrative. The optics were absolutely devastating. Split screen on every financial news network. On the left side of the screen, Trump at a podium in Switzerland telling the world how successful he is. On the right side of the screen, a sheriff's vehicle parked outside the building that literally has his name in giant golden letters. For a man whose entire identity is built on the perception of wealth, power, and success, this was the ultimate humiliation. The building is not just a property. It is his brand. It is the physical manifestation of the Trump mythology. And while he was overseas trying to project strength and dominance, the legal system was literally seizing the symbol of everything he claims to represent. But wait. It gets worse, because while all of this was unfolding, while Europe was walking out, while Japan was collapsing, while Trump Tower was being seized, Canada decided this was the perfect moment to strike back. Remember, Trump had spent weeks publicly mocking Canada, making jokes about annexation, threatening massive tariffs, treating America's closest ally like a subordinate vassal state. And Canada had been quietly preparing a response that would expose Trump's threats as empty bluster. Within hours of Trump's Davos speech, the Canadian government invoked emergency legislation that most Americans did not even know existed. The National Strategic Reserve Act. This is a law that allows Ottawa to restrict exports of critical resources during times of national security threat, and the Canadian cabinet made a calculated decision. They determined that Trump's repeated threats, his jokes about military annexation, his constant destabilization of the bilateral relationship constituted exactly that kind of threat. The restrictions went into effect immediately. Uranium exports to the United States blocked. Canada supplies roughly 25% of the uranium that fuels American nuclear power plants. Potash, the critical fertilizer component that underpins American industrial agriculture, blocked. Canada produces 33% of global potash supply, and American farmers depend on it for spring planting season. And most devastating of all, heavy crude oil from the Alberta tar sands, which American Gulf Coast refineries are specifically engineered to process, diverted. Not completely blocked, but rerouted to Chinese buyers who were more than happy to pay premium prices for guaranteed supply. The impact on American markets was instantaneous. Energy futures spiked 6% in after-hours trading. Agricultural commodity prices jumped as traders realized American farmers might face fertilizer shortages right before planting season. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the U.S. dollar as global commodity buyers rushed to secure access to resources that were no longer flowing south across the border. And the political humiliation was even worse than the economic damage. Trump had spent months positioning himself as the ultimate deal maker, the tough negotiator who could bully smaller countries into submission. He publicly mocked Canada as weak, dependent, unable to stand up for itself. And Canada just proved him catastrophically wrong. They did not issue angry press releases. They did not tweet complaints. They did not appeal to international organizations. They simply turned off the tap and redirected their exports to buyers who were not threatening them with annexation. It was economic statecraft executed with surgical precision. And here is what made it even more humiliating. China immediately stepped in to purchase the diverted Canadian resources at premium prices. So Trump's aggressive posture toward Canada did not just backfire. It actively strengthened the economic relationship between America's two main geopolitical rivals. Canada got higher prices and diversified its customer base. China secured critical resource supplies, and the United States got higher energy costs, potential fertilizer shortages, and a dramatically weakened relationship with its most important trading partner. This is the definition of strategic incompetence. Trump picked a fight he could not win with a country he thought was too weak to fight back. And now American businesses, American farmers, American consumers are going to pay the price. Meanwhile, Trump was still in Switzerland, still trying to deliver his speech, still completely unaware that his administration had just lost control of 3 separate crises simultaneously across 3 different continents. The White House press briefing the following morning was absolute absolute chaos. The press secretary walked into that room facing an impossible task. She had to explain why European allies walked out. She had to explain why markets collapsed while the president claimed strength. She had to explain why Trump Tower was being seized. She had to explain why Canada just cut off critical resource supplies. And she had no coherent answers for any of it. Reporter after reporter stood up with questions she could not address. Is the president facing personal bankruptcy? Deflection. Why did the Prime Minister of Denmark call the president's statement a fabrication? Anger. What is the administration's plan to address the fertilizer shortage facing American farmers? Accusation that the media was conspiring against the president. Can you confirm that Secret Service had to coordinate with New York sheriffs at Trump Tower? Refusal to comment on ongoing legal matters. It was the sound of an administration that had completely lost control, not just of the narrative, but of events themselves. And here is what makes this fundamentally different from previous Trump controversies. Past scandals were political. This is mathematical. You can dispute anonymous sources. You can call investigative journalism fake news. You can claim the polls are rigged, but you cannot argue with a 12% market crash. You cannot spin a diplomatic walkout that was broadcast live. You cannot gaslight a seizure notice served by law enforcement. We are witnessing something unprecedented in modern political history, the collapse of the post-truth era in real time. For 5 years, Trump operated in an environment where he could manufacture his own reality, where his supporters would believe his version of events regardless of factual evidence, where the sheer force of repetition could overcome objective truth. But Davos was different. He was not speaking to his base. He was speaking to people whose money depends on accurate assessment of reality, and those people fact-checked him not with journalism, but with markets. Bond yields do not care about your narrative. Currency traders do not respond to charisma. Algorithms execute based on data, not loyalty. So what happens next? That is the question everyone in Washington, everyone on Wall Street, everyone in foreign capitals is asking right now. And the honest answer is we are in uncharted territory. But here are the scenarios that are actively being discussed in the highest levels of government and finance right now. First, the legal escalation. The New York Attorney General can freeze additional Trump assets within days. We are talking about golf courses, commercial properties, potentially even liquid assets in bank accounts. The $454 million judgment is not going away, and New York has demonstrated they are willing to enforce it aggressively and publicly. Second, the market instability. If panic selling continues, if investors lose confidence in American economic management, we could see circuit breakers trigger on the stock exchanges. That has only happened a handful of times in history, and it would represent a crisis of confidence that goes far beyond normal volatility. Third, the diplomatic fracture. NATO has called an emergency ministerial session for next week. The topic is not Russia. The topic is whether the alliance can function when the largest member is led by someone who European allies fundamentally do not trust anymore. Fourth, the constitutional question that nobody wants to say out loud. Can a president effectively govern when his personal assets are being seized, when he is facing financial ruin, when the conflicts of interest between his business survival and national interest become impossible to separate? And here is what terrifies people who understand how Trump operates. A humiliated narcissist is the most dangerous variable in politics. Trump has spent his entire life equating his personal worth with his public image, and that image just shattered in front of the entire world. Expect erratic behavior. Expect desperate attempts to change the subject. Expect him to try to create a new crisis big enough to make people forget this one. He might fire Jerome Powell. He might impose emergency tariffs on Europe. He might even engineer a military confrontation to reassert dominance through force because persuasion has failed.